Hello, everyone. I'm glad you are able to join us today. This is our Launch and Learn. I want to say it's our fourth one, if I'm correct, Charlene. And this is supporting student success for universal design. Again, I want to welcome you to this. And I am Rhonda Blackburn. The information on the side, I'm former TxDLA president. I'm the president of USDLA. Actually, I need to update that. I love these. I've been on all of these from the connecting ones all the way into the Launch and Learn, Lounge and Learn, not Launch, Lounge and Learn, because I learn something every single time. And of course, with the people on this webinar today, between John, Lucas, and Darcy, who knows what we're going to learn, because you know they have tons of wonderful information for us. But did want to also say on this webinar is also Charlene Stubblefield. Joy, I don't know if you would like to say something.
Good morning. Oops. Yes. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our Launch and Learn. And I'll come back at the end to kind of say some things to you.
Perfect. I didn't mean to do that one. Let's get out of this. But for a lot of what we're doing right now is really kind of looking at kind of helping people move forward and how can they be supported. And that's why I love about this particular webinar. We do have these every single Thursday, so make sure you definitely join us. But I would like to go ahead and turn it over to John, Lucas, and Darcy to let them introduce themselves and get going with our webinar. Thank y'all for joining us.
Thank you so much for having us today. And as was mentioned, we're going to be talking about universal design for learning. We're going to look at some data specifically around how institutions across Texas, what types of barriers they see in their course content, as well as some opportunities for transformation and what it means, especially given the moment. I'll let my colleague Darcy jump in and introduce herself. I think you're on mute, Darcy.
My name is Darcy Hardy. I am with Blackboard. Just a little bit about my background. I was one of the founders, one of the 6 or 7 of us that sat around a table in 1995 and started TxDLA. I'll say a little bit more about that later, but my role at Blackboard is more about dealing with the strategic elements of online learning. And I'm happy to be part of this particular event. And you're going to be hearing from someone at Blackboard, John Scott, who is absolutely one of the key people that can talk about this particular topic. So happy to be here.
Thanks, Darcy. I'm John Scott. I'm one of the product managers on the Blackboard Ally team, and I'm also one of our key researchers. So I do a lot of work in visiting institutions. Over 2019, I actually visited 51 higher education institutions around the world to learn how they're thinking about accessibility, the challenges that they face in scaling and addressing issues of equity and access. So really rich insight into the challenges and opportunities that institutions face. And I've been doing a lot of work this year around looking at trends in accessibility data. I'm going to share a little bit of that today. My background is in higher education as a researcher. I did my doctoral work around networked learning and pedagogies of remix, so how notions of digital remix play into digital literacy practices, but really that focus on collaboration and inclusion, fostering a sense of belonging for diverse students is the kind of perspective I bring to thinking about universal design for learning. So before we kind of jump into kind of the specifics of the presentation, we wanted to start off, since Darcy has such a rich history with the group, as well as an understanding about accessibility and distance learning across Texas, a little historical insight.
Great, thanks, John. I just wanted to take a moment and say a couple of things about accessibility and about Texas. And, you know, it's a really proud moment for me to see what TxDLA has become and how much it is a leader not only in Texas, but across the country. It's the largest state group that's part of U.S. Distance Learning Association, and does more than any other group. But I also want to point out that, you know, when we started, we being those involved in distance and online learning, when we started back in the mid-90s and we thought about accessibility with our courses, but I mean, I came out of correspondence study in the 80s, worked on projects there where we literally would ship off a study guide for a student that was blind to a company in Chicago, who would then 6 weeks later send back this giant stack of Braille documents for these learners, which was not timely. It wasn't the most effective use of time, but that's how we responded. We responded one-on-one, one student at a time. And so accessibility was on our minds, I think, when online learning started, but it was, for a little while, it was important, and then it kind of fell off to where we stopped worrying about it like we should have. And people got involved in, you know, the higher education myths, like that as long as you have a password, you don't have to have content that's accessible, which I'm sure John's going to point out that's false. And now it's back at the front and center again, and as it should be. And so it's great that TxDLA is offering a certification in accessibility, and it makes me very proud to be part of Blackboard, because not only are we a member, but we're also a sponsor of the association. And we are very, very focused on accessibility and accessible content and products at Blackboard. And that's one reason why we're really, really happy to offer this session today. So I'll turn it back over to John to really get things started.
Thanks, Darcy. And so I wanted to start off just sharing a little bit about kind of what happened. I mean, we know we've all been talking about this transition to remote instruction. And from a content perspective, I actually looked at just a handful of institutions across Texas to see how much more digital content was being uploaded into their courses. So I looked at kind of how much content was uploaded in March of 2019 and compared that to March of 2020. And what I saw, and it's a small sample, but it seems consistent with what I'm seeing across institutions, there was a 403% increase in the amount of digital course content uploaded into learning management systems, comparing those 2 months. And just looking at one institution, that was an increase of over 6,500 PDFs, over 3,000 new Word documents, over 1,600 presentations, and almost 7,000 images. And you know, Darcy's anecdote about that process for converting a document into Braille, you know, while that is certainly covering broad distance, today, you know, we still have a fairly reactive approach to accessibility in higher education. There's still that kind of one-to-one, here I am, I'm a student with a disclosed disability. This is the content that my instructor has given to me. Now I have to work with an access team to have that remediated to work with my assistive technology. And so this sudden influx in the amount of digital content really putting a significant strain on the teams that are trying to do that work, and putting those students at risk of not getting their content in a format that's accessible in a timely manner. When we consider both some of the opportunities and barriers in this digital transformation, certainly this transition to more digital content has real benefits for students with disabilities. EDUCAUSE actually just published a great white paper documenting some of the affordances of digital content and some of the preferences students discuss about having access to digital materials, being able to use them with their assistive technologies, being able to access content wherever they need to. So there's some clear advantages for this kind of digital conversion. It also opens up lots of interesting opportunities for different types of engagement with digital text for all learners. When you're talking about kind of print text, it's really, you know, a single kind of modality of engagement. You're fairly limited to the book or the paper and taking kind of notes around it. There's not a lot of options for transforming those print-based materials into other types of learning modalities. So there's some great opportunities, but there's also some challenges. Again, how accessible is the digital content that was uploaded in that month? You know, if we're talking about an additional 7,000 images, how many of those images have a text description or an alt text so that someone using an assistive technology can access that content? And those access issues really extend more broadly to thinking about people with limited resources at home to access that digital content. We often see this talked about as the digital divide, and certainly it was exacerbated during the crisis. And we saw a lot of attention being paid to, or kind of just new understandings about how limited access to computers and high-speed internet was for so many students at home. So we have these opportunities and barriers. First, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the barriers. And so, of course, you have those students who rely on assistive technologies to access their course material, students who use a screen reader, whether it's for visual impairments or for other types of processing challenges. You have those students who really rely on academic support services. So thinking especially about first generation students, minority students who really spend a lot of time and get a lot of value out of having those on-campus academic support services to help them manage studying, manage anxiety, things like that. And then of course you have those access issues for students with limited access to computers or high-speed internet. Now, I wanted to just imagine, you're a student here, you're getting ready to study for a big exam, you log into your digital course, and this is what your course reading looks like. It's a dreaded scanned PDF. An instructor has photocopied, their textbook or article, scanned it in as a digital file. And, if you're a student opening this file, first, if you're a student using a screen reader, this is just completely inaccessible to you. This is just an image as text. And so you can't use it at all as someone who's using a screen reader or other types of text-to-speech technologies. If you're a student with dyslexia, this blotchy font, off-centered margins, going to be really challenging for you to read. And then I spoke to a student support specialist at a community college. She talked to me about some of her students with anxiety issues or who have reading challenges. They see a document that looks like this and they just immediately feel defeated. It triggers anxiety for them. It triggers a feeling of being overwhelmed, of being not able to really digest a text that looks like this. So it's a barrier for really everyone. It's not mobile friendly. And so when we think about accessibility issues, we want to really think about them also as usability issues. There's really compelling research happening right now. And some of the studies, one study in particular, they found among non-disabled users who engaged with more accessible website content that they retained more information and they actually completed tasks more quickly. So applying that to a document like this, ultimately we could be affecting how well our students are able to understand and comprehend the information when they're working with these inaccessible documents. So I wanted to share a little bit of data that I've mined from institutions across Texas higher education to just see how prevalent those issues are. Again, imagining this in the context of a sudden influx of digital material. So in 2019-2020 courses, PDFs that were scanned, so 13 to 15% of the PDFs that we looked at were scanned PDFs. And for large institutions, on average, that was over 25,000 of those PDFs. So you can imagine not only the strain for those access teams having to remediate that content, but also for the students who are encountering, more than 1 in 10 of their documents being a scanned PDF, being a document that is inaccessible, mobile unfriendly, hard for them to work with. Untagged PDFs is another big challenge with digital content. This may be from publisher resources. It may be from native Word and PowerPoint documents that have been exported as untagged PDF because they've been saved for print. And so 33 to 39% of the PDFs that we looked at were untagged. And if you're not familiar with what tags are the metadata that are embedded into a PDF that provide someone who's using a screen reader the reading order of that document. So you imagine if you're a student, you're using your screen reader and you're trying to move through a document that doesn't have tags, you just have no idea where you are in the reading, where your place is. And it can also limit how well a document can be transformed into mobile-friendly formats. It essentially allows a document to be reflowable. So, talking about on average, large institutions, 83,000 of these untagged PDFs in their 2019-2020 courses. Missing image descriptions, as I mentioned, 79 to 87% of the images that we looked at were missing a description. And this is a challenge, of course, if somebody is blind, but also a lot of students want to be able to use text-to-speech materials, generate MP3s of their content so that they can listen to it on the go or pair it while they're reading. And so missing alt text actually affects a much larger percentage of students than just those with a visual impairment who rely on a screen reader. Images were a big part of content in learning management system courses. Again, on average, you're talking here of large institutions, 263,000 images that are missing a description. Missing headings, another kind of key accessibility issue. So when you're creating a Word document, using the styles tool, it's going to improve the navigation and the organization of that Word document, as opposed to just, and I was guilty of this certainly as an instructor, you start off a document, you do 16-point boldface at the top of your document. It looks like it's a heading, it looks like it's providing an organizational structure, but to a computer that's trying to read that document, it actually is not going to recognize it as a heading unless you use the headings, the styles tool in Word. And so it's a great way to author more usable, more accessible documents, because you can very easily generate a table of contents. If you're using a screen reader, you can easily tab through the headings. So just a simple part of authoring practices, but a lot of us just are not aware of that because we learned how to use Word without formal training. We picked up the tools, we created our documents, and we developed our practices. Unfortunately, they weren't necessarily the most accessible practices. So, 23 to 27% of the documents that we saw missing headings. And then the last issue we'll talk about here in terms of, again, these barriers, documents with contrast issues. And so here we're really talking about the readability of documents. How easy is it for someone who may have color blindness or other types of visual processing challenges? How clear is that content? I'm sure we've all been in a presentation before. Somebody did a beautiful PowerPoint with a pink font and a yellow background, and everybody in the room is trying to discern the text and be able to read it. So it just slows us down and makes it more challenging to process documents. 32 to 34% of the documents that we saw had those contrast issues. Now, one of the I think really important ways for institutions to think about addressing some of these issues is by having access to data. Data plays a really important role in how institutions can really work at scale. Again, when you're talking about thousands of documents, a scalable approach that's informed by data, really important to being more reactive, more responsive to changing circumstances. One of the tools that Ally provides is called an institutional report. And that really provides you as an institution, as an administrator, with some insights into accessibility issues across the learning management system. And again, that data-informed approach, just so important to responding rapidly to change, improving those workflows. Darcy mentioned, back in the day, this really elongated process for creating a Braille document, but there are other ways I think that we can think about using data to improve our workflows, and then being able to track progress. That's such an important part of being able to really make headway on these issues. Is how do we know, as instructors are uploading new content, where we're at, what are our goals, and how are we doing kind of in achieving those goals to really provide a more inclusive experience for all our students. I'll pause there. Darcy, anything happening in the chat or our moderators? Any questions come up? How are people in the audience thinking about the accessibility of digital content at their institution? Are there tools that you're using to have those types of insights? What do you see as the most extensive barriers to access at your institution? Anything in the chat, or should we keep rolling?
Go ahead and keep going. I don't see anything, but as people start thinking about it and pop it in, we can probably push
No
this.
problem. We can certainly return to it. So let's start to think about some of the opportunities. And one of the great things, again, about digital content is that it's highly flexible and adaptive. You know, we're talking about digital binary code. It can be really easy converted into lots of different types of formats, lots of different ways for it to be delivered across different types of devices. And when we do that, we can open up opportunities for students to have more choice in how they engage with their content. Ultimately, we can empower them to be more autonomous, more independent learners. I like to think about this as what I call a pedagogy of multiplicity. I think when we look across various kinds of learning theories, did something come up in the chat?
Yeah, actually, it's a really good question from Tracy. She said that she's worried about videos like via YouTube mashups, and she doesn't see an ally marking on them. You know, so how can that be addressed?
Yeah, so specific to video content, in terms of what Ally does, Ally will check whether or not YouTube videos, whether or not the auto captions have been manually edited. And they will include that in our institutional report. And so that's our first kind of foray into checking captioning. A lot of the caption platforms, providers, or video platforms like Panopto, they will kind of provide some insight into whether or not videos are captioned as well. It's definitely a really challenging area. It's certainly an area that was impacted during the transition to remote instruction, where suddenly you have now all of these Zoom sessions, all of these lecture capture, and how do you kind of make sure that they're captioned? And the biggest challenge for us, and why Ally is going to stay focused in content and allow really caption providers to take on this work, because it's such specialized work, is that auto captions have come a long way. They're pretty accurate if you have a clear speaker, a good microphone, but caption accuracy is really important, and it needs to be 99.9%, or students can miss something, especially students with a hearing impairment. So it is a manual process. It's time consuming. It's costly for institutions. On Ally side, we're continuing to, and it's part of our 2020 roadmap, to try to work on more workflows to make the process of connecting to caption providers more seamless, having more access to the data around what videos are captioned. So definitely something that we're doing work on. Back to this pedagogy of multiplicity. So we see, I think, in a lot of learning and literacy theories, this real emphasis on multiplicity. In universal design for learning, it's really threaded throughout the three key principles. You hear this kind of mantra of multiple modes of, and one of the key areas that I'm going to focus on today is this idea of multiple modes of representation. That is, representing the learning content, the curriculum resources in various sensory modalities, in various formats. And this is really linked to some of the neurological research that has been done around how those different sensory experiences, different modes of interaction can enhance, they activate different parts of our brain and can help kind of reinforce learning. This is very distinct from learning styles. Learning styles been around for a long time as a kind of learning theory. It's really come up against a lot of empirical or lack of empirical evidence to suggest that somebody is only an auditory learner, only a visual learner. And so here we're really kind of focusing on learner preference, the idea of being able to choose and engage with these different modalities as modes of reinforcement. Literacy theory has also taken up this kind of banner of multiplicity, multimodality, multimodal textual reading experience really becoming a prominent in literacy theory. Thinking in digital context, the ways that we engage with very multimedia experiences compared to the very kind of monomodal culture of print-based culture. And so it's becoming more integral to how people read and write in the world. There's this notion of multimodality. And then the third area is really this idea of multiple devices and learning contexts, especially when our students are learning at home. They're not just learning in a classroom where we have a very controlled sense of the environment. They're learning on multiple devices. They're experiencing courses and content in very unique ways based on their bandwidth, based on if they're trying to study on a job or study with kids in the background. So how do we kind of create experiences that cater to these notions of the multiple? And this is an area where a tool like Ally can really help. And there are other tools that do this type of work of transforming content into alternative formats through automation. So using machine learning algorithms to automatically generate alternative formats of learning materials and make those available to students on demand. In the case of Ally, this is really embedded in the course experience. So anywhere the student sees one of these little Ally A indicators next to a course file, and we're primarily here talking about Word, PowerPoint, and PDF files, the student can click on that, open up a window, and they'll see various options for how they want to engage with that content. So I'll talk a little bit about kind of the different uses that we're seeing of these formats and how they map to certain types of learning needs and different types of learning modalities. First, I'll just mention before we get to the slide that shows a breakdown of the types of formats downloaded, the pandemic really showed a dramatic increase in the amount of usage of these formats as students had access to increased amounts of digital content, as they had more demand for flexible learning materials in their various learning contexts. We just saw this dramatic spike in usage. In April, 1.3 million alternative formats downloaded across the United States. And so really playing a pivotal role for students who, again, the original file may not meet their learning needs. They're looking for an alternative, especially in the absence of some of the support services they're used to, or again, if there's a delay in being able to turn around for them a more accessible file. So across Texas, in 1 year, there's been 822,000 of these downloaded across Texas higher education institutions. The most popular download, and this is consistent with national averages, is the tagged PDF from Word and PowerPoint files. So over 62% of that total are tagged PDFs. And what's important here is that you're talking about students who may be accessing a Word or a PowerPoint file on a device at home that doesn't have Microsoft Office. And so they may not be able to open that file. They can pull down a tagged PDF through Ally as a way to engage that file. If it's a very large PowerPoint file, a tagged PDF is also going to be a compressed file size, so it's better for bandwidth challenges. And students just may be more accustomed to reading the PDF. It's been the preeminent file format of academia. But the great thing here is that you can encourage faculty, or faculty can take it on themselves to keep content in the native file format. So uploading the Word or PowerPoint document, it's going to be more accessible typically for people who may be using an assistive technology. At the same time, you don't have to worry about these access challenges because they can still pull down a tagged PDF if they need to. The next format, HTML format. This is a mobile-friendly format. So 24% of the content that we saw downloaded as an alternative format was in the HTML. And it's responsive to screen size. So those students who are relying on the mobile device, they can get an HTML format. They don't have to pinch and zoom and have a really difficult time reading a PDF on their device. OCR PDF, now we're talking about those scanned documents, that the 10% or 15% of documents, PDFs that were scanned, almost 4% of the total alternative formats downloaded were OCR. So we extract the text from the document, clean up the font, try to provide a more readable, more usable document. I'm going to kind of go quickly through the list here, but EPUB, really dynamic format. Only 3.4% of the total alternative formats downloads was an EPUB, but it's a great format to load up on an e-reader program. There's free ones, on different devices. You can customize fonts. So if you're a student with dyslexia, you can get a more readable font. You can adjust the contrast. You can annotate and highlight it. Really cool format, EPUB. MP3 audio, about 2%. A lot of times we think, oh, that's going to be a much higher number. Students are going to really gravitate towards downloading and listening to content. And there's a significant amount, 15,000. But when you think about what types of content is amenable to being listened to, you're really talking about a subset of content, a syllabus, math stuff. It's probably not going to be amenable to listening. So 2% showing students are selective in the types of formats that they choose, and they choose the right format for their learning context. Braille format, Darcy mentioned that Braille challenge. This really gives the opportunity here to automatically convert it to electronic Braille format for students who use a Braille reader. Beeline reader is a very dynamic, cool format. It applies different color gradient to lines of text so that students can focus better. It can improve reading speed as well as understanding for students with dyslexia or other processing challenges. And then we do a machine translation format. Not every institution has this format enabled, so it's a very small number, but it could be a really valuable tool for second language learners. One of the reasons more institutions haven't enabled this format yet is because they don't want to turn it on in foreign language courses for obvious reasons. So we're working on some features to provide more kind of access control in terms of where this format is deployed. It's certainly also the subject of intense debate about second language learners and whether or not they should be accessing content in English versus in a language translation where at least they have a starting point if they're struggling with the content in English. So limited amount of institutions using that. Will be interesting to see if that changes over time. Just to get a sense of the widespread usage of these formats and the increase again due to the pandemic. In the spring 2020 term, downloads per FTE, so institutions, the number of downloads they had per their student population was almost 1.5. And so just shows, I think, the really significant impact that access to these types of learning materials makes on the student experience and really immediate in that impact. The institution turns on Ally or a similar type of tool that provides alternative formats, and students just find it within their course workflow and start to really use them and become dependent on having those types of options. And so just to sum up on this alternative format side, this idea of really empowering students to be choosers of how they engage with their learning materials. And I think that this idea of student choice, of fostering learner preference, it really helps to develop metacognitive awareness. Students become more aware about how they learn best and what types of learning processes work best for them. And I think that can really help to develop lifelong learners. Students who are attuned to how they learn best are able to navigate different types of contexts, different types of content to meet their learning objectives. And so, more broadly, I think that this really plays a role in helping our students, especially struggling students, become better, more effective learners. We'll pause here again. Anything coming up in the chat related to alternative formats? And again, I talked about it in the Ally context. Oh, did something come up?
No, I just wanted to let you know that nothing has come up from that. So.
Okay, great. I talked a little bit about this data in the Ally context, but as I mentioned, there are some other tools available that do some of this work. And also, it's interesting to just consider, again, the types of choices that students make when they have options. Being able to see that breakdown of the different content types, the different formats downloaded, I think provides some insight, some important insight into what are the learning needs of our students or the learning preferences that they're demonstrating to us through the data. Now, it would be wonderful if automation and machine learning could solve all of our accessibility challenges, but that's just simply not the case. Automation only takes us so far. Inclusive design is really both a science and an art. Creating accessible content is an art form. And so simple fixes to accessibility issues with course files, the work that a faculty member can do or others on campus can do, can really improve the quality and effectiveness of the alternative formats that are outputted through machine transformation. So that's a really important point. Ally is not going to try to automatically inject alt text. And so if you're a student who wants to be able to listen to your content, if it doesn't have alt text, you're not going to hear the content of your images. If it doesn't have a heading structure, that MP3 is going to be less clear to listen to. So making some of these accessibility fixes, is going to impact the alternative formats. And it also I think helps shift the conversation a little bit about in terms of why, as a faculty member, you're committing the time to do this accessibility work, because the impact is going to resonate beyond just your students with disclosed disabilities. It's going to, potentially impact all of your learners. How Ally tries to reach faculty, and because it's such a challenge for institutions to train and reach very busy, time-constrained faculty, is by trying to embed accessibility feedback into the course experience, into the instructor's workflow. And again, thinking beyond Ally, and generally when we're talking about supporting faculty, especially in the context of this rapid transition to remote instruction, how do we meet faculty where they're at? How do we understand the culture of their course, the kinds of teaching practices and pedagogy that they had in on-ground courses, and use that as a starting point to say, how do we, how does those modalities translate or not translate into an online context? How can we build in experiences that really meet the faculty with tutorials and with information in the process of building or engaging with their course? Something come up?
Yeah, so I think one of the ladies said that there are times that because of some of the things that you have to do to make things accessible, it could kind of hinder the growth of like new technology tools on campus, or people deciding that they want to use particular tools.
Yeah, how accessibility fits into your culture as an institution, and how that impacts the types of tools that you adopt, the types of content that you use. How I really like to think about it, and how it's often talked about in the UDL context, is, can you, especially in the case of content, can you create a +1 of the content? So you may have a really awesome infographic, and it's really rich. It conveys a complex topic in a very kind of friendly way, in an accessible way to people who are visually minded. You don't want to get rid of that content just because it's going to be hard to make it accessible to someone who is not visually able to engage with that, right? You want to keep that file, allow those students to enjoy it, but create a +1 of it. So in the case of an infographic, you're not going to cover all of it in the alt text, but maybe in the alt text, point the student to a text-based description. And there you may describe the infographic in some more narrative form, some way to convey the information that's visually there in a more textual way. And so you didn't get rid of that inaccessible infographic, you just created an alternative format for students to engage with it. And so you can apply that +1 principle. This is something that Thomas Tobin, who is really spearheading quite a bit of this UDL pedagogy work, it's something that he has talked about a lot. And I think it's a great strategy to use in terms of, not limiting the types of experiences that students can have, and learning content that benefits to them, but just making sure that everybody can have equal access to those same types of resources, or that resource in another delivery. Talking kind of back about these accessibility issues, and it also speaks to that point. Some of these issues are going to be easier to address than others. When you're talking about untagged PDFs from a publisher, an instructor is just not likely going to learn how to use a tool like Adobe Acrobat to tag a PDF. It's time consuming. It's not even their content, right? It's from a publisher. They're just not going to be able to kind of do that work on their own right away. So being able to triage as an institution and really work collectively to address these barriers is going to be so important. And part of the goal with a tool like Ally around raising this awareness with faculty is not the idea that they're going to change everything overnight, but that they start to understand where the potential barriers are. They can more proactively reach out for help, and they can pick off some of the easier content for them to fix, some of the easier things for them to address, while the institution ramps up efforts to tackle some of the more challenging issues. Here's just a screenshot of what our instructor feedback interface looks like. And so for the instructor, they're going to get a sense of where particular issues are in the document. They're going to see a list of what all the issues are. They're going to get kind of robust feedback and guidance about how to go back to their authoring tool to fix the file. And so the emphasis here is not on allowing them to fix content through Ally, but rather helping to train them to use their authoring tools so that the next time they create their syllabus, they're creating it accessible from the start. That's just so important. If you're making accessibility an afterthought with everything, you're just not going to make the kinds of progress. You're not going to see that culture shift that's really necessary. Ally also provides instructors with a course accessibility report. And so this is going to provide them with a breakdown across their entire course about what types of issues they have, also what types of content they have. And I think that that's really cool from an instructional design perspective, just having insight into what kinds of content, what kinds of tools in my learning management system am I using? Am I adding discussion forums? Is my content just a bunch of PowerPoint lecture slides, or am I diversifying the types of content that my students engage? So this course accessibility report is really an analytics dashboard that helps instructors try to prioritize where to start, where they can make impact, what are the kinds of patterns in different accessibility issues that they may have in their content. Similar to the similar to the alternative formats usage, during that pandemic, during that transition, we saw a really rapid increase in the amount of work faculty were doing addressing accessibility issues. And so that's just so important when we think about, again, the strain on those remediation teams doing this work. For faculties to be able to take some of this on, it's going to help ease the burden on them. And so in April, over 121,000 files improved through Ally. Question come up, Rhonda?
Yeah, we have one in the Q&A. Is there a way for an instructor to view content resources from an accessibility perspective or point of view of people with impairment? So, for example, see how text looks with the screen reader, et cetera.
That would be really cool. So Ally does not provide that kind of a capability. It is the best way, I think, in faculty workshops and demonstrations to use a tool like JAWS and have JAWS kind of go over the text and for people to hear how their content sounds on a screen reader. One of the cool ways that instructors can assess how accessible their document is, though, is by downloading the MP3 through Ally, so that you'll be able to hear, does it have a clear structure? Does it have alt text description? So it's not the same experience as having a screen reader run over it, but it will give you a sense of how your content sounds aloud. And it was really interesting, actually. I was talking to one faculty member at a medical university, and he said that he had started to download his PowerPoint and lecture contents as MP3s himself, and he would listen to them to see how clear they were. He would assess them for clarity, for precision in language, and not only because he knew that his students were listening to the content while they were sitting in their cars in traffic and things like that, but just from a delivery perspective, he was using that MP3 as a way to assess the materials. Another cool way to assess whether or not your content is accessible is by exporting Ally's HTML format, because then you can really see, since the HTML format is going to be based on the tagging structure of the document, you can see, is that tagging order correct? Is the reading order correct? Because that's going to be how a student with a screen reader navigates it. So while it's not reproducing the experience kind of verbatim, it is at least giving you some clear insight into what this content looks like transformed. What kind of improvements can you make to make that transformation clearer and better? We'll take a look at this side. This is now looking at Texas institutions and their engagement with the accessibility feedback over almost a year, so roughly a full academic calendar August to May. This is looking at the number of files improved per month, so the number of files that resulted in an improved accessibility score, the number of files that were altered through the feedback. So, you know, an altered file may not result in an improved accessibility score. So we have the altered data point, and then we have the number of times that the indicator was actually clicked. So that little indicator that Ally pops up into the courses next to the course file, how many times instructors click that. And you can see the data actually really reflects that increase in usage in files uploaded that we saw in March. So that 400% increase in digital content uploaded. Well, the really encouraging thing here is that it also resulted in the highest month of engagement by faculty with the feedback. So over 37,900 of those files that were uploaded in March were actually improved. And so really encouraging sign. Even clicking the indicator, just building awareness is just such an important first step for institutions as they try to make this culture shift. Now, interesting to look, 54% of the indicator clicks in Texas over that time period resulted in an attempt to fix the file. So instructors are, you know, about half the time that they click and explore, they're also attempting to fix it. 85% of the fixes during that time resulted in an improved accessibility score. So they're able to ingest the feedback, ingest the various tutorials, and make their fixes at a pretty good rate of improvement. That's a solid B there. For people just getting started, that's, I think, a strong starting point. And then really interesting in Texas, actually, 100,000 of the files were improved through that course accessibility report. On national average, about 30% of the files are improved through the course accessibility report, but that's playing a more prevalent role in Texas institutions. 53% of the files improved were done through that course accessibility report. You can also, on the right here, this table illustrates the types of files that were improved. And you can see that, again, most institutions, they're just getting started. Most faculty just becoming familiar. They start with images, 117,000 images that now have alt text. So about 62% of the files improved were images. It's the easiest thing to fix through Ally. It's a fairly straightforward kind of process. So not surprising there. Oops, looks like I have a typo there. That PDF number was actually 18%. I'll correct that in the final PowerPoint, but that was 18% of the improvements were PDFs. That's the most prevalent file type in the LMS, so in courses, so not surprising that that would be the second most fixed file. It's the most challenging file to fix, so it's very encouraging to see even, you know, that number of improvements being made. And then Word docs were about 15% and presentations close 14.5%. So, you know, 15,000 presentations that are a little bit more accessible, 27,000 Word documents that have been improved. So really encouraging to see this work being done by faculty and institutions across Texas. We also had, for Global Accessibility Awareness Day, a really cool challenge for institutions to see who could fix the most files through Ally. And so this is just a fun way that we try to gamify accessibility, provide some incentives. So we created a global leaderboard. We had 59 institutions that participated. They opted into this leaderboard. It tracked the number of fixes that they made at that institution. So academic leaders met with faculty virtually, did workshops, you know, really kind of revved them up to compete, to outperform their peers. And it resulted in just an incredible amount of improvements to files. Over 57,000 files were improved across 4,800 courses just on that Global Accessibility Awareness Day. So it was just a real testament to the work that people put in, but also I think to the power of data. Having access to data that allows for gamification. Obviously, you can't create a leaderboard without having the live data events that are tracking this type of fixes. institutions have access to their own data. And so it's, they can make this kind of, we've had institutions do department level competitions where they had the English department and the science department competing to make fixes. So it's just a great way to, again, make accessibility part of the culture, part of the practices, really thinking about that culture shift. And that to me is just the key theme here, is that really starting to think about how does accessibility and inclusive design become an integral part of course design. And I think that, you know, hopefully in kind of laying out some of the learning benefits of the alternative formats, some of the engagement benefits to accessibility on not just students with disabilities, but all students, you start to see that the value from a course design perspective to making this part of your practice. It's of course that there's an ethical issue. There's, you know, you want higher education in its mission is to embrace inclusion and diversity and to advance, you know, the career development of all learners. But there's also a pedagogical incentive here. And I think that that's a key value for institutions as they're thinking about making accessibility really a priority and a value at their university or college. I'll pause there for questions. Anything come up? We're at 1:23, so I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for questions and wrap up.
No questions right now.
All right, so we'll just quickly wrap it up here. And I kind of mentioned this already, thinking inclusively with your content, not just alternative formats, you know, not just automated modalities to do this or automated tools to do this, but also thinking about those plus ones, that alternate content, thinking about diverse textual forms. So, you know, trying to balance kind of dense academic text with maybe more types of blogs or other types of digital media content that's available online. It can be a really great way to just pull in different voices, different types of perspectives, different types of reading practices. I think what we see today is that people make meaning in such diverse ways in the world today, using such diverse tools. Leverage those different types of texts in your course. And then thinking about the diversity of those voices too. You know, is your course content representative of different cultures, different races, different global perspectives? We foster a sense of belonging and inclusiveness when we feel like our voice as a student is represented in that course. And then also thinking inclusively with assessments. This is obviously not an area that a tool like Ally covers, but this is, I think, just so important that we can apply this principle of choice to assessments as well. You know, giving students the option to do a paper or maybe do a multimedia project that represents, you know, and meets the criteria, the standards for the learning assignment, but allows that student some choice. I think that I've done this in my teaching practices at Berkeley in an online course. I always found that when the students had some choice, they took more pride in their work. They felt a sense of autonomy and ownership of the work, especially when they took on an alternative project like a multimedia video or something like that, just a sense of pride. And I found that those works still had academic rigor. They still met the criteria. We developed rubrics to assess the different types of projects. Just a nice way to open up choice in terms of assessment. Opening up opportunities for students to connect with their personal experience and their home culture. Make the student part of that learning experience. That's going to foster a sense of belonging if they can make those connections to their background knowledge, to their experiences, to their family culture. It's a great way to foster dialogue, especially in online context where you want to be able to foster social presence. You want to be able to allow students to develop camaraderie and a sense of community, connecting to identity. Even if you're in a math course, I think that there's always opportunities to do that. And then being able to apply those understandings to the real world. You know, we have such a great opportunity in today's world where our projects can make a global impact. Digital communities stretch across the globe, looking for opportunities for them to take their learning and apply it in some context to solve a real world problem can be a really great way to drive home relevance, another key principle of universal design for learning. wrapping up, the 3 keys I hope that you took away from today's webinar is really the importance of data, accessibility data, and content data to improve readiness and responsiveness, especially during these times of crisis, during transitions, increasing student access and choice, why that's important, that idea of multiplicities, pedagogical multiplicities in texts, in content types, in devices, the importance of that to today's learning environments and learning experiences. And then this idea of really scaling professional learning to catalyze this culture shift, to make inclusion an integral part of course design experiences. So hope you were able to get a few nuggets or takeaways from today's discussion. We have a really active community of accessibility champions at usergroup.ally.ac. If you're not part of the community, I encourage you, anybody to join up, even if you don't have Ally. Folks are always sharing cool resources. We share all of our research. I just published a paper that focuses on the impact across Texas. So that white paper is available on the user group site that looks at some of the data that I shared today. And with that, I'll leave you with a free resource here, and maybe we can drop the links into the chat, or I can follow up. It's also available on the user group. We have the File Transformer. It's a free standalone website where you can convert digital content into alternative formats. So if you don't have Ally, you want to play around with it, or you want to introduce it to a student to use, we released this for the pandemic. It's a free resource that you can use to convert files into those alternative formats. We have an authoring guide out there, just very simple, quick start guide to authoring and uploading more accessible digital content into your courses. And then we have a broader kind of pedagogical look at applying universal design for learning principles to course design. And so kind of going beyond just content, thinking about things like assessment, collaborative learning, social learning, and how to apply those UDL principles to make the learning experience a little bit more inclusive. With that, I'll pass it maybe to Charlene. You want to wrap it up?
I'll wrap it up, Lucas or John. Sorry, thank you, thank you. This was an awesome presentation. If you could stop sharing your screen for a minute, I want to share something on mine. Thank you. Just want to say thank you, you guys, for this awesome presentation. I think the takeaway for me was the gamifying accessibility. That was just genius. That was completely genius. Loved it. And even Darcy reminding us that as far as connecting to TxDLA, that you were at the table, you know, with those people with the first, can't remember how many, but the number of even creating TxDLA. So definitely grateful for your service. Just want to share with you really quickly the TxDLA website with Lunch and Learn, and showing you our next session will be on HighFlex. So if you're interested, go ahead and sign up for it. John, will your PowerPoints be available to share when we make the video available?
Absolutely.
Awesome,
Happy to share
awesome.
that. I'll share the white paper too. You can, so
Great.
that has the data written up.
Awesome, awesome. So we will definitely be sharing that on the website now. It's a reminder, it'll be available for 2 weeks for non-TxDLA members, but if you become a member, all of the webinars that we did with the Keeping Connected and the Lounge and Learn will be available. The other thing I want to talk about is, you know, many of the conferences were canceled because of the pandemic, and we've now scheduled our virtual conference to take the place of our face-to-face. It will be September 29th through October 2nd. Please, please, please mark your calendars. There was no need for us to change our theme. Through the Looking Glass, a wonderland of innovation. We are all in this crazy place of being a wonderland of innovation. We are the experts. And so get ready to be a part of the conference. You'll get more information later on, but just mark your calendars. And with that said, we close out our 4th Lounge and Learn webinar session. Thank you, Blackboard. We appreciate you today. With that said, goodbye, everybody.